share your reflection.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, for having me. It's lovely to be here in the church, and it's lovely to be in the city of Oxford. Back in the time when I was your age, that's a long time ago, turned 50 this year, in September. In my younger days, I used to be interested in the Negritude movement. The Negritude movement is a movement that developed within black intellectuals, francophone black intellectuals, both in France and in the French colonies. And it was developed to challenge colonialism, racism, and Eurocentrism. And one of the things the Léopold Sédar Senghor, the Aimé Césaire, what have you, used to rail against was this sort of colonial mentality of, which was captured the mantra of seeing Paris and dying. So for the colonized Africans to have made it, it was to see Paris, and then after Paris you could die. And there is something with us academics about Oxford, that when you have been invited to speak in Oxford, whatever the setting, the circumstances, it's like a bucket list item. As you have done that, you have arrived. The Lord can come and take his servant and go home. So thank you for making the dream true. I'm not planning to die, but it's a nice thing. It's a nice gesture. And talking about negritude, obviously, blackness, brings us to the topic that was proposed to me today. And as Amanda said, I was asked to talk about Jesus not being white, and the modern church is not. And on the surface of it, when I read this, I thought, this looks like a truism. And everybody should say, yeah, of course Jesus wasn't white. And of course the church shouldn't be white, obviously. But these are very intelligent people, and they are very astute spiritually, so they wouldn't have proposed this topic if it weren't, if there wasn't a case for reflection. Because for me, from a theological point of view and from a rhetorical point of view, I think this statement sounds like a riposte or a rebuttal or a rejection or even a warding off. It's like warding off a bad spirit of something that is of a fact, a perception, an observation that maybe Jesus somehow, somewhere along the way in his story, he has become white, and that the church he died to build has become white as well. So the question really that I want us to think about in this 10-15 minutes is what sort of process, by what process Jesus became white, and the church he died to build as well. And to do so, I'm going to go through readings. I didn't realize that. I didn't know that we were allowed to do readings or not. So I'm going to read the Bible. Sure, a lot of the Bible. I don't do the Bible, so when I'm invited to speak to a congregation, I do all my annual readings, because theologians don't read the Bible that much. So I'm going to read from Isaiah 9. It should be verse 1 to 7, but I'm just going to read verse 2, 6, and 7. This is a reading that you normally get around Advent times. Have we started Advent time? No, it's coming.
You've got a few weeks.
Yeah. I'm ahead of the time. Yeah.
John would like it to be longer, but
But the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness. From that time and forever, the zeal of the Lord Almighty will do this. And the next bit is from Matthew 16, 13 to 18. And there's Jesus talking to his disciples in Caesarea Philippi, and he asked them, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others still say Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." But Jesus said, "But what about you?" And then Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on you, the rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Finally, this is Pentecost. When the day of Pentecost came, that's Acts chapter 2, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole place. Imagine this place. Where they were sitting, they saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them, and all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit, and they began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. So for me, these biblical passages speak for themselves in terms of who Jesus is and what the church is or should be understood to be in its origin, in its identity, and in its mission, and actually how we as believers should know who Jesus is through the Spirit. I want to say a few things. I want to say that the whole business of Christianity is a love story. It's a relationship between God and humanity. And this is made historically real through what I see as a process, or sort of a cyclical process of covenants and then betrayals and then renewals. And before I get lost in too many details, and I don't get to the point, I want to say that the business we call whiteness, however we'll understand whiteness later for me, is or the kind of whiteness, a place that has compromised the church or threatens to compromise the Christian church in the West, is one of such betrayals. That's the one thing we want us to look at. So do be patient. I want to suggest that at different times in the history of humanity, God has touched the world with his essence, or God's essence. Apologies for the gendered language, sometimes it slips in. But with God's essence and God's touch, in different ways, through individuals, nations, communities, and those communities will be representatives of humanity, to move us from places of darkness, to move us from places of despair, to move us from places of moral bankruptcy, to move us from places of unhealthy ways of living in relationships to places of light, happiness, and wholeness. And when I say wholeness, I really mean wholeness, physically, mentally, spiritually, and relationally. And I think when I look at creation, I see a covenant. When I look at Noah and Abraham and Moses in the Exodus, I see a covenant. When I look at the incarnation of Jesus, I see a renewal of a covenant. And when I see the Pentecost, I see the renewal of a covenant. I see God touching our humanity and intending and wanting us to be in a renewed relationship. And each time I see a person, a people, a group who are touched by God, to go to speak to humanity, to go to be God's light and representative in the world, to go and renew this covenantal relationship between God, humanity, and humanity with one another, and humanity and the rest of creation. And each time that a covenant, a contract, a relational instrument with God is thrashed or trashed or dishonored, there is a new movement. So the old document, as Thomas Aquinas puts it in the Mass song for Corpus Christi or Christi, the old document is always replaced by a new document. I'm going to stop waffling and actually that is really interesting. So where am I going with this? What has this to do with whiteness and Jesus Christ and the church? So this is where I'm going to make what I think is maybe problematic, controversial, but that's why we're here to discuss these things. So I want to say that in the history of our world, God one time in our history touched the world again to renew relationship, to bring holistic and wholeness in life. And this place is what was known as Europe. And this was at the end of what we call the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. Because by the 5th century of our Christian era, the Christian church, which was born of Pentecost, had lost its way. The church that was started when God gave the Spirit to Peter and the other disciples had fallen victim of institutional decay. Having been co-opted by the so-called Holy Roman Empire, or having co-opted the Roman Empire, it had mutated into a tool of oppression. It's a sort of a racketeering trafficker of God's grace on the black market of indulgences. And it was a time of corrupt clergies. It was a time when women were being burned on stakes. You know what about the Inquisition, and so on and so forth. And God's light disappeared from the world because the institution that was the embodiment of that light had fallen victim of that darkness itself. The church had fallen into darkness. But then, towards the end of the 14th century, those who study history do feel free to poke holes in the theory. I love when people I see by the end of the 14th century, especially between the 15th and the 18th century, something quite extraordinary happened in Europe. There was this explosion of renewal in bodies, in minds, and in spirit. And you have all these four major happenings that I see as a presence of the Spirit of God in this place. And that is through the Renaissance or the rebirth, the Reformation, scientific revolution, and what is known as Enlightenment or the Siècle des Lumières. It's as if there was just a light came to Europe. And this, for me, is phenomenal because I'm interested in the history of whiteness and how you became to be known as white. Because I don't think that you were actually white, so you became white. So it's been, because I studied black theology, I think I know blackness somehow. I don't understand the other side of me, which is white. I'll come back to that later. So in that time, you look at incredible names from Francesco Petrarch to Immanuel Kant. You go through people like Da Vinci, Gutenberg, Galileo, Copernicus, Luther, Calvin, Isaac Newton, Darwin, Descartes, Locke, Hobbes. I can go on and on and on and on. I get lost in that time because for me it's phenomenal to see all these things happening so concomitantly in one space. It was the birth of a new civilization. Humanity entered a new phase. And from then on, this little place went on to dominate the rest of the world. I stayed over with friends tonight. Last night I came from Manchester and I stayed with friends because I wanted to see your beautiful city. And you know, when you wake up in the morning, your brain is trying to catch up with where you are that morning. So I saw this book on the bedside, and it's called Why the West Rules. So I thought, wow, this is really serendipitous. And the person who wrote this is Ian Morris, and he says this. When I saw this, I thought it was serendipity, but then I thought maybe the Holy Spirit is speaking to me, and is giving me the words to share with you. But this is what Ian Morris said. When we ask why the West rules, we are really asking two questions. We need to know both why the West is more developed, that is more able to get, that, which means it is able to get things done than any other region in the world, and why Western development was so high in the last 2 centuries that for the first time in history, a few countries can dominate the entire planet. There are many explanations that he gives, theories, and some more stronger than others, as theories are. The problem is, for me, I'm not satisfied, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with what he's saying, but I want to suggest that there is another way of looking at this. And what I want to say is that God saw the suffering of His people, or of God's people, everywhere, and He touched the world again. And this touch affected every aspect of our being, the intellect, the soul, the spirit, and the bodies. And Europe was a place that where the touch happened. And this was not done for the purpose of just for the sake of Europeans. It was done for the sake of the world. So these human minds, touched by God's Spirit, enlightened and blessed with visions to invent, to discover, to rediscover spiritual, intellectual, and technological wonders, the world was open to them. And from the Netherlands, from the UK, from Spain, from Portugal, wonderful ships reached out to the rest of the world. And so do the missions to evangelize, to Christianize the world. And what I'm trying to say really in all this is that it is through this encounter between Europe and the rest that God's gifts were misused and corrupted. Because I think God's gift somewhere in this transaction were mistaken for cultural and intellectual achievements of superior human reason and ingenuity. And the journey to other nations, instead of being exposing opportunities to share in God's blessings, they became means of domination and conquest. Now, I know I'm being very, very balanced, but then that's why these are reflective places. Britannia ruled the waves, the West ruled the world. Western civilization became the substitute for the covenant I was talking about. And the messenger substitute themselves to the sender. And like the Prince of Tyre, Ezekiel 28:1-5, there's a sense that maybe there was an elevation that people saw themselves as omnipotent or reaching the rank of the divine. And I think this is how whiteness entered the world. Because for me, whiteness has nothing to do with race. It's just an aspect of it. For me, whiteness is this construct of power and domination and imperialism. And the racial connotations developed over time to justify the privileged position occupied by Europeans and their offshoots, and that came to be known as the West as they came into contact with people who did not look like them. Look, I can assure you, before 2002, when I came to this country, I did not know I was black. At best, I thought I was one. At worst, I thought maybe I'm Hutu or Tutsi. When I transcended myself, I became African or Pan-Africanist. I became only black when I came in a place where my blackness had some sort of political implications. But this is not about me, this is about Jesus and the church. Jesus was not, and Jesus could not be white. Because despite what we read in Isaiah, despite what Peter said, this God human being was beyond the powerful, chose to come in the world in a position of powerlessness, in a condition of the lowly. When people in the liberation theology, people have that theology, liberation theology, that's why they talk about Jesus' privilege or option for the poor. And when people like myself, Anthony Reddy, James Cone talk about Jesus being black, we're not talking about this swarthiness of our look. We're talking that, we're saying that Jesus always side with the oppressed, the downtrodden, the hungry, the weak. Jesus is who they are. And Jesus is where they are. And that is where the church should be. And that is what the church should be. And I will finish with this. The modern church is not and cannot be white. And this is literally impossible because the center of Christianity has shifted, whether it is in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia. But this is not where the problem is. Because I think the theological model that has been implemented in the rest of the world still has in itself this seed of whiteness, this seed of power, domination, hierarchy, heteronormativities, all manner of stuff, even when they are being lived out in black, brown, and other colored places. There's always that risk of pride. Pride is pride and arrogance. But the Church of Christ, what I want to say is, it's not black, it's not white. It is a church. It's a community of the covenant of love, and the covenant of justice. It is a community that has seen God's light and is filled with God's Spirit. It's also a community that has been entrusted with the power, truly the power that dwarfs any other power, which is the power to the local of the divine. It is the community that has the power to lock out and to lock in. It's a community that has the power to bind or to set free. And that makes us a community of accountability and responsibility. For the world, for ourselves, and for God. And with that power, that mandate, I don't think that I would choose to be white. Thank you very much.
Amazing.